They say when a child is born, the universe gently exhales, not because something new has begun, but because something ancient has returned. In the hush of a dimly lit delivery room, with the flicker of hospital monitors and a quiet hum of machines, a baby enters the world. Tiny fingers, closed eyes, and a heart that has already lived more lives than anyone in that room can imagine. The doctor announces the birth. The mother weeps. The father trembles. And in that moment, a silent truth lingers in the air. This child is not just a beginning. This is the return of a soul, shaped by karma, pulled back by invisible threads of intention, choice, and consequence. We live in a world where parenting is often explained through biology, psychology, and social dynamics. But beneath all of that lies a truth most never dare to touch: the karmic bond between a parent and child. This is not random. This is not accidental. This is the echo of past lives whispering through the bloodlines of the present. Why are some children born into wealth, while others face suffering from the very first breath? Why do some parents feel an unexplainable connection with their child, while others wrestle with resentment or distance? The answers don't lie in genetics or luck. They lie in karma. Karma, not as punishment or reward, but as memory, as magnetism, as a kind of spiritual gravity that pulls lives into orbits they once danced before. Every child you meet was once someone before, perhaps a friend, perhaps a stranger, perhaps even an enemy. And now in this life, you are their guardian, their teacher, their mirror. But what does it mean to parent a soul, not just a body? What happens when your child's destiny is entangled with yours, not by chance, but by design? When their joys, their suffering, their very presence in your life is a continuation of something left unfinished. In Buddhist thought, a child is not someone you own, but someone you've been entrusted with by karma. You are not molding clay. You are guiding a soul back to its center. You are not just raising a human. You are walking alongside a traveler, helping them remember where they've been, and nudging them gently toward where they need to go. Sometimes that journey is full of sweetness. Sometimes it's filled with pain, but always it is sacred. Imagine this: a mother holding her newborn for the first time. Her heart swells with love she never knew existed. She whispers, "I've waited my whole life for you." And maybe, just maybe, that soul in her arms whispers back, "So have I," because karma remembers. Love remembers. And the path between parent and child is never walked for the first time, only once more. Slight pause, soundscape softens. We often think the role of a parent is to teach, to guide, to shape. But sometimes it's the child who teaches the parent, because in many cases, the child comes not as a student, but as a teacher in disguise, a mirror of the parent's unresolved karma, a lesson dressed as laughter, a wound disguised as innocence. And so, the moment a baby arrives isn't just the beginning of their life. It's the continuation of a cosmic agreement, a karmic handshake between souls who once crossed paths and now return, not to repeat, but to repair. As you listen to these truths, pause for a moment. Think back to your own family, to your parents, to your children, to the bond you could never quite explain. What if that feeling of familiarity wasn't imagination, but memory? The journey of karma and parenting isn't about knowing all the answers. It's about waking up to the questions you didn't know you were allowed to ask. And the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. In the quiet arrival of a child, the universe is not starting something new. It is simply continuing a story, one that you have been a part of long before this life began. You ever wonder why certain family dynamics feel like déjà vu? Why a mother's worry echoes in her daughter's heart decades later? Or why some siblings are like soulmates, while others seem born to challenge one another? There's something deeper than genetics or upbringing at play. Something ancient, subtle, and karmic. Karma isn't just a concept scribbled in dusty spiritual texts. It breathes, weaves, and pulses silently through our most intimate relationships, especially those within our families. It's not a punishment system or a divine scoreboard. Think of karma as cause and effect written into the fabric of consciousness, like an invisible thread linking one lifetime to the next, one soul to another. Let's imagine it this way. Before you were born, your soul sat at the edge of eternity, reviewing past actions like a sacred film reel. With compassion and clarity, you chose the perfect environment to grow: parents, siblings, circumstances. Not because they'd be easy, but because they'd be karmically right. Yes, even the difficult relationships. A child isn't randomly assigned to a mother. In Buddhism, it's believed the bond between parent and child is one of the most karmically loaded. A child may be returning to repay kindness, to heal wounds, or, sometimes, to challenge patterns that have been repeating for generations. The soul doesn't seek comfort, it seeks evolution. You see, family is the first stage where karma performs its dance. Think about how early we begin to experience emotions like love, jealousy, resentment, and deep attachment, all within the family unit. Those experiences are the fertile ground where karmic seeds sprout. Have you ever noticed how cycles repeat? A father emotionally distant from his son, just as his own father had been. A mother smothering her child with protection because of a past life fear of losing them again. These aren't just patterns, they're echoes of karmic agreements, waiting to be seen, felt, and healed. Sometimes we inherit not just eye color or temperament, but unspoken karma. A grandmother's unresolved sorrow may subtly pass to her daughter and granddaughter, not through DNA, but through energetic memory. Buddhism teaches that unresolved karma doesn't die, it waits. And often it waits within bloodlines. But don't mistake this for a curse. Karma doesn't trap us, it offers us doors. Family dynamics are not your prison, they're your practice. A volatile relationship with a sibling might be the very fire your soul needs to learn patience. A parent who never validated you may be the mirror in which you finally learn self-worth. Every argument, every silent dinner, every tear-streaked apology, these aren't just moments. They're karmic openings, portals to break chains that may have bound your lineage for lifetimes. And when you step through them with awareness, the entire family thread begins to shift. Here, as something quietly profound, healing your own karma heals the family karma. When you stop reacting with anger, when you forgive the mother who couldn't love you in the way you needed, when you choose not to carry the resentment passed down to you, that ripple moves backwards and forward in time. Your ancestors feel it. Your future descendants will live freer because of it. Karma also explains why some people feel like they were born to parent. There are souls who once abandoned their duties in another life and now return with a burning desire to care deeply. Others who might struggle to connect with their children are working through karmic barriers that were forged in lifetimes long gone. None of it is random. All of it is sacred. Even adoption in this light is karmically orchestrated. A soul doesn't just need a biological lineage. It needs the right environment, the right lessons, and the right energetic mirror. Sometimes that mirror comes through unexpected love, a different race, a foreign land. But if you look deeper, you'll see the connection isn't less real. It might actually be more intentional. And what about the painful stories, abandonment, abuse, estrangement? Buddhism doesn't ask us to justify harm, but it invites us to explore what might lie beneath it. Sometimes, karmic relationships are about closing old debts, completing difficult lessons, or choosing to break cycles through courage and compassion. You aren't responsible for what was done to you, but you are powerful enough to choose how to respond to it. That response becomes your karma. In every family, there are unspoken roles: the peacemaker, the rebel, the caregiver, the scapegoat. These roles aren't always fair, but they're rarely accidental. The rebel may be the one who disrupts generations of silence. The caregiver might be the one repaying lifetimes of neglect. Karma chooses the cast, but consciousness rewrites the script. So take a moment to reflect on your own family bonds. What patterns keep repeating? What emotions get triggered again and again? These are the clues. Karma doesn't hide from you. It shows up every day in your reactions, your judgments, your longings, and your unspoken wounds. And the beauty, you don't have to fix it all. You just have to see it. Awareness alone is often enough to begin the unraveling. The invisible thread becomes visible, and once seen, it can be transformed. The journey through karma isn't about blame, it's about liberation. And family, for all its complexity, is the perfect arena for that liberation to begin. Because when you understand the karma beneath your family bonds, you don't just survive them, you transcend them. Have you ever looked into your child's eyes and seen something that shook you, not because of them, but because of what it awakened in you? Maybe it was a flash of anger, maybe it was deep sadness, or maybe it was fear. A fear that you thought you had buried long ago. Children have this uncanny ability to reflect the parts of us we've tried to ignore, suppress, or deny. In Buddhist teachings, this is not a coincidence. It's karma at work, not as punishment, but as a profound opportunity for awakening. A child's tantrum can stir up the rage we were never allowed to express. Their sensitivity can trigger the shame we still carry from our own childhood. Their defiance can ignite the powerlessness we once felt when we were silenced. They mirror our emotional wounds with startling accuracy, not to hurt us, but to reveal us to ourselves. But here's the thing, the reflection doesn't lie. It simply holds up a mirror to what's already inside. When your child disobeys you and you feel disrespected, ask yourself, where in your past did your voice go unheard? When their tears irritate you instead of evoking compassion, ask, was there a time when your tears were dismissed too quickly? When their confidence feels like arrogance to you, question, did someone once belittle your own sense of self-worth? What if the behaviors you're trying to correct in your child are actually the wounds you haven't yet healed in yourself? Karma brings us not only the people we need to grow, but the precise moments that trigger our transformation. In a family, especially between parent and child, karma is like a sacred dance. And often, children arrive as our greatest spiritual teachers, not because they say wise things or know ancient truths, but because they touch the exact nerve that still aches within us. You might think, but I don't want to pass my pain down. I want to break the cycle. And that intention is noble. But breaking the cycle doesn't mean controlling your child into becoming someone different. It means facing the shadows within yourself that the child has exposed. That's the Buddhist way. Healing doesn't happen through control. It happens through awareness. Through the willingness to sit in the discomfort, to explore the origin of your emotional reactivity, and to take responsibility for what you're unconsciously projecting onto your child. Because let's be honest, much of what we label as bad behavior in our kids is often just our own discomfort with emotions we never learned to process. A child cries, and we want silence, not because crying is bad, but because we were taught that emotion is weakness. A child sets a boundary and we feel rejected, not because boundaries are wrong, but because we never had the courage to set our own. So when your child triggers you, pause. That is karma inviting you to look inward, to trace the thread back to its root, to stop saying, "Why are they like this?" and start asking, "Why does this affect me so deeply?" And then, and this is crucial, meet that part of you with the compassion you've always needed. Because the healing of karmic patterns doesn't come from blame, it comes from awareness and love. There's a Zen proverb that says, "When the student is ready, the teacher appears." In parenting, that teacher often arrives in the form of a 5-year-old refusing to put on their shoes or a teenager slamming the door. These moments may feel like chaos, but if you listen closely, they're sacred. They are invitations, openings, mirrors, and every time you choose to respond with awareness rather than reactivity, you soften the karmic imprint. You teach, not just your child, but your own inner child, that love is stronger than fear. That presence is more powerful than control. That healing is possible right here, in this messy, beautiful moment of parenthood. Because in the end, your child doesn't need a perfect parent. They need a present one. One who's willing to look within, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. And when you do that, something extraordinary happens, not just between you and your child, but within you. You begin to reclaim the fragmented parts of your own story. You begin to parent yourself while parenting them. And in that sacred process, karma begins to dissolve, not through effort, but through love. And perhaps that's the point. The child you thought you were raising is actually raising you. Let's keep going. Because just when you think karma is about pain, it reveals something even more powerful: purpose. Have you ever wondered why certain moments in parenting leave you shaken? Not because of your child's behavior, but because of something deeper. Something tender, raw, almost forgotten. It might be the way your child cries when they're left alone, or the way they reach out for love and your instinct is to pull away. It's not because you don't love them. You do immensely, but something within resists. This is where the forgotten child inside of you begins to stir. Yes, your inner child. Parenting isn't just about raising children. It's also the mysterious and often painful rebirth of your own childhood. Every giggle, every tantrum, every wide-eyed question from your childhood is like a mirror, not just to your actions, but to the places inside of you that once longed to be held, understood, and protected. We often think we are the teachers, but sometimes it's our children who become the tiny Buddhas sent to awaken the slumbering parts within us. Take a moment. When your child throws a fit, do you find yourself panicking or lashing out? That reaction isn't just about the present. It's the voice of a wounded child within you screaming, "No one ever listened when I cried." When your child needs constant reassurance, and it exhausts you, perhaps it's because your inner child never got that safety, and now feels incapable of giving what they never received. Buddhism teaches us that samsara, the cycle of suffering, continues until we awaken, and parenthood may very well be the spiritual alarm clock that rings loudest. This isn't a punishment, it's grace in disguise. Imagine this. Every time your child triggers you, it's not to hurt you. It's the universe guiding you back to the exact point in your life where you were left alone in the dark. And now, in the light of adulthood, you're being invited to walk back into that room and switch the light on. This is the sacred power of karma, not to punish, but to offer you the chance to heal what was once broken, not through theory, but through love. So instead of asking, "Why does my child make me feel this way?" ask, "What part of me is still asking to be seen?" This is what happens when you begin to parent not only your child, but yourself. And what a beautiful revolution that is. You're no longer just reacting, you're reconnecting. You're no longer escaping your pain. You're reparenting the one within you who never had a guide. It may come in the quiet moments, like when you hold your child and suddenly realize you were never held like that. Or when you speak gently and a part of you aches because no one ever spoke gently to you. This pain is not your enemy. It is the gate. And the only way to raise conscious children is to become the conscious parent your own younger self once dreamed of. So as you move forward, remember, parenting is not the end of your freedom. It is the path to your most powerful healing. Because when the inner child awakens, the cycle doesn't have to continue, it can transform. Sometimes pain travels silently, passed from heart to heart like an heirloom no one wanted but everyone carries. You see it in a mother's anxious tone echoing in her daughter's voice, in a father's cold distance reflected in his son's struggle to connect. Generational karma is not just a poetic phrase, it's a spiritual reality. It's the energetic imprint of wounds unspoken and stories unresolved, looping through families like a song stuck on repeat. But here's the miracle. Karma isn't a life sentence, it's a life lesson. And when you become conscious of the script you've inherited, you gain the power to rewrite it. Maybe you grew up never hearing, "I'm proud of you." Maybe love in your family came with conditions. Achieve more, behave better, never complain. You might have vowed, "I'll be different with my children." But when your child pushes your buttons, something primal reacts before reason arrives. You yell, withdraw, or shame, only to feel crushed with guilt later. That's not failure. That's generational karma showing its face, giving you a chance to finally face it, feel it, and heal it. Breaking generational karma doesn't start with your child, it starts with you. Imagine this. Your child throws a tantrum, you want to shout, but instead you pause, you breathe, and you ask yourself, what part of me feels unseen right now? What wound is aching beneath this moment? That pause, that breath, that question, it's the sound of a cycle ending. You are not just parenting your child, you're reparenting yourself. You are becoming the mother you needed, the father you longed for, and in doing so, you're planting new seeds in the soil where old pain used to grow. Some say, "But my parents did their best." That may be true. And honoring that truth doesn't mean you must carry their burdens. You are not being disloyal by healing. You are being courageous. Because every time you choose love over control, empathy over judgment, presence over avoidance, you are choosing a new karmic blueprint for the next generation. It's not always pretty. Healing rarely is. Some days you'll feel like you're failing more than you're fixing. But healing is non-linear. It spirals. You'll return to the same wounds again and again, but with deeper awareness and more tenderness each time. Let's be honest. Sometimes healing feels like losing your mind before you find your soul, but that's the path. You are not going backward. You are unraveling the tight knots woven by years of survival. And with each thread you pull loose, your children breathe a little freer. You may wonder, will I ever get it right? Maybe not perfectly, but remember, it's not perfection that heals, it's presence. Consistent, compassionate presence. Karma is not just about cause and effect, it's about awareness and choice. The moment you become aware of a toxic pattern, you are no longer just a product of it. You become the pivot point, the turning tide. The one who said, "This ends with me." And that matters more than you know, because your children aren't looking for perfect parents, they're looking for real ones who apologize, ones who reflect, ones who show it's okay to be messy and still worthy of love. You are that parent. You are the karmic chain breaker, and the next time your child looks into your eyes, they won't just see a parent, they'll see freedom in progress. Now let's go deeper, not into the past, but into something even more subtle. Let's look at how karma and parenting are not just about lineage, but also about the energetic language spoken in the everyday, unspoken moments. What if I told you that your child doesn't need a perfect parent, just a present one? We live in a world where parenting is saturated with checklists, milestones, Instagrammable moments, perfect routines, Montessori toys, sugar-free snacks, and yes, even daily affirmations taped to the bathroom mirror. But amidst the pressure to get everything right, many parents miss what matters most. Not the perfect lunchbox, not the perfect bedtime story, not even the perfect response to a tantrum, but the moment, the one right in front of you, the child who looks into your eyes and sees home, the opportunity to pause, to breathe, to sit beside them in their joy or their pain without fixing, without rushing, without judgment. Presence is sacred, and in the wisdom of Buddhist thought, it's the only place karma unfolds and heals. When a child cries and we resist the urge to hush them, when we simply stay with them in it without escaping, we're breaking an age-old cycle. Because maybe, when we cried as children, no one stayed. Maybe our pain made others uncomfortable, so they silenced us. Maybe we learned to numb, to suppress, to perform. So when we choose to stay instead of fix, to witness instead of control, we're not just comforting a child. We're rewriting an ancestral script. We're saying, I see you. You are safe. You don't need to be perfect to be loved. That's not just parenting. That's liberation. And here's what's extraordinary. Presence doesn't require expertise. You don't need to read the latest parenting book. You don't need a degree in child psychology. You don't need to have had perfect parents yourself. You just need to show up with your breath, with your messy, beautiful humanity. Presence is your highest offering. It transcends technique. A quiet moment spent watching ants with your child in the garden can teach them more about patience, curiosity, and wonder than a dozen overplanned lessons. A sincere apology after raising your voice shows them emotional responsibility. A spontaneous dance in the kitchen shows them freedom, and a calm silence after a difficult day. That shows them it's okay not to be okay. In Buddhist teachings, the present moment is where awakening happens, not tomorrow. Not when you've got your parenting act together. Not when your house is quiet and clean and your to-do list is complete. But here, now, because your child is not waiting for the perfect version of you. They're looking for connection. They're seeking safety. They're yearning to feel seen. And the truth is, so are you. This right now is the sacred mirror of karma at work. When you stay in the moment, when you breathe before reacting, when you kneel instead of shout, when you simply notice what is, you are dissolving karmic patterns passed down through generations. You are planting new seeds, seeds of presence, seeds of compassion, seeds that say, I may not be perfect, but I am here. And that's enough. What if the greatest legacy you pass on isn't found in achievements, but in how present you were with your child's soul? What if they grow up remembering not what you gave them, but how they felt when you sat beside them, fully, wholly, and without distraction? No performance, no striving, just presence. And that is where the healing deepens. Let's continue. There comes a moment in every parent's journey when holding on becomes more painful than letting go. Not because the love fades, but because love, in its highest form, demands freedom. Letting go doesn't begin when your child leaves for college or moves out. It begins the day they first push your hand away and insist, I can do it myself. It begins with every decision they make that contradicts the picture you held in your heart. It begins in the quiet ache of watching them stumble, knowing you cannot protect them from every fall. But what if letting go is not a loss? What if it is a sacred act of trust? In Buddhism, the act of non-attachment is not cold or indifferent. It is the warmest kind of faith. It is saying, I trust the wisdom unfolding in you. I trust the karma you carry. I trust the path you must walk, even if I don't understand it. Parenthood, then, becomes a spiritual discipline in surrender. You are not just raising a child. You are guiding a soul on its karmic journey, and that soul has its own lessons to learn, its own dharma to fulfill. This surrender is not passive. It is active grace. It is staying present while loosening the grip. It is offering guidance but not control. It is speaking truth but letting silence do its part. It is standing by the gate, not locking it. Letting go also means forgiving yourself for the mistakes, for the moments of fear, for the times you held on too tightly because you didn't know better. Every parent at some point mourns the child they imagined and learns to love the child they have. And that is a holy transformation. To release your child spiritually is not to abandon them. It is to stop obstructing the light of their becoming with the shadow of your expectations. In Zen, there's a koan. No snowflake ever falls in the wrong place. And so too, no child is born into the wrong family, and no experience arrives outside of time. The tears, the tension, the triumphs, each plays its note in the symphony of karma. Letting go allows that music to breathe. There is beauty in watching your child choose, especially when you disagree, because in that choosing they become real. They become human, and your love grows not because they obey, but because you witness them as they truly are. This letting go extends to our past too. Many parents carry silent baggage, regret over what their parents did, resentment over what they didn't, unspoken vows to be different. And yet, we often find ourselves repeating the very patterns we swore we'd end. Letting go also means releasing the grip of our own upbringing. It means acknowledging, my parents did what they could, I now choose a different way. It's not about blame, it's about liberation. When you stop trying to rewrite your own childhood through your child's, you finally allow your parenting to be honest, spontaneous, and free. And then there's the ultimate letting go. The one that frightens every parent deep down, letting go of the idea that you can prevent your child's suffering. You can't. You were never meant to. Pain is a teacher karma often assigns. And though you may wish to rewrite the syllabus, your child needs those lessons. The caterpillar must struggle to emerge from the cocoon. If you cut it free too early, you rob it of the strength its wings require. So let your child struggle. Let them fall. Let them question, break open, rebuild. Stay nearby, but don't steal their becoming. Letting go in its purest form is the highest act of love a soul can offer another. It says, I walk beside you, not in front of you. I trust your path, not my plan. I release you because you are ready. And when you do this, when you surrender the illusion of control and enter the grace of presence, you don't lose your child. You gain a deeper relationship. One based not on dependency but on mutual respect. Not on fear but on freedom. Not on attachment but on awakened love. And that kind of bond, it doesn't break. It breathes, it evolves, it transcends. Because in that act of letting go, you don't just free your child, you free yourself. And in that quiet release, something extraordinary happens. Your child begins to return, not because they must, but because they choose to. Not as someone you shaped, but as someone who was always meant to be. And isn't that the most sacred reward of parenthood? To witness a soul rise fully into their light. Because you had the courage to let go. There's a silence that lingers in the air when a child stares off into the distance, seemingly lost in thought. It's not just imagination, they're listening to something deeper, something older, something not entirely their own. Children don't enter the world as blank slates. They arrive like ancient tapestries, woven with threads of stories they've never been told, pains they've never personally endured, and dreams they don't yet understand. This is the weight and wonder of ancestral karma. Have you ever looked into your child's eyes and seen your grandfather's sadness, or your mother's quiet resilience? Have you ever heard a child say something that felt far too wise for their age? That's not coincidence. That's memory, not of their own life, but of a lineage whispering through them. Science may call it epigenetics. Spirituality knows it as ancestral imprinting. Buddhism simply calls it karma. In Buddhist philosophy, karma isn't limited to individual action. It's also collective, familial, generational. The seeds of a grandparent's unhealed trauma may blossom into the emotional sensitivity of a grandchild. A father's chronic anger may echo into his son's restless spirit. Patterns repeat not because we're cursed, but because they remain unexamined, unloved, and unhealed. And children, they are the loudest echoes. But they don't carry these echoes to suffer. They carry them to transform. Not to punish us, but to wake us. When a child throws tantrums without understanding why, when they fear abandonment despite always being held, when they overachieve just to feel safe, it's not always just personality. It's legacy. And the moment you realize that, your role shifts from disciplinarian to spiritual detective, from problem solver to pattern breaker. Parenting then becomes sacred work. You're not just raising a child, you're raising a lineage. And here's the astonishing truth. Children often come into your life not because they need to be taught, but because your soul needed their presence to remember. You see, the universe doesn't waste pain. It recycles it into possibility. And it sends people, often the smallest ones, to awaken that journey. Your child may be here to trigger the very thing your ancestors ran from, not to hurt you, but to heal you. So what do we do with this realization? We stop asking, "What's wrong with my child?" and start asking, "What story is trying to be rewritten through them?" We sit in quiet reflection. We journal about our grandparents, our parents, the patterns we swore we'd never repeat but somehow did. We pay attention to our child's fears, their sensitivities, their joys, and we trace them back, not with blame but with compassion. And sometimes, the healing isn't in changing your child at all. It's in holding space for what they carry, recognizing that beneath the surface, they're not just navigating their own path, but helping to complete an unfinished song that's been echoing through your family for generations. This chapter isn't about guilt. It's about grace, about realizing that every soul in a family system is doing their best with the tools they were given, and that maybe, just maybe, your child came into your life not to repeat the story, but to end it with love. Let's carry that wisdom forward, because something extraordinary unfolds when a parent chooses to heal, not just for their child, but for every voice that came before, and every life that will come after. And so we arrive at a deeper question, not just about who our children are, but about what they're here to help us remember. Keep listening. The echo still speaks. It always starts so quietly. You raise your voice just a little, but it's not really anger, just stress. You tell your child to behave, to be respectful. They talk back. You snap. The tension builds. And before you know it, you're reacting in a way you promised yourself you never would. Later, as silence falls over the room, you feel it. That sinking weight in your chest. The echo of your own childhood. The look in your child's eyes that once belonged to you. This is the moment. The moment where karma offers a choice. Will you repeat the wound, or will you repair it? In every family, there are hidden scripts, stories unconsciously passed down like heirlooms. These are not just cultural habits or family traditions. They're emotional blueprints, unspoken expectations, buried pain. When a parent lashes out, it's rarely just about the present moment. It's often a reenactment of something older, deeper, inherited. But what if the very pattern you fear the most is the one you're here to break? You see, karma doesn't demand punishment. It offers awakening. Each time you pause instead of yelling. Each time you apologize sincerely, instead of defending your ego. Each time you choose empathy over authority. You are rewriting the story, not just for your child, but for your entire lineage. This is how healing becomes generational. This is how trauma ends, not all at once, but moment by moment. You become the sacred interrupter of pain. Let's be honest, repair is hard. It requires humility. It means telling your child, I was wrong. It means listening to their tiny voice with the same reverence you wish someone had shown yours. It means giving them what you never got, while healing the part of you that still aches for it. In Buddhism, the Bodhisattva is one who delays their own enlightenment out of compassion for others. And isn't that what conscious parenting is? You show up, even when you're tired, even when you're triggered, even when you have no roadmap. You show up not as a perfect being, but as a present one, not because you're flawless, but because you're aware. And in that awareness, you carry the power to transform generations. Karma is not your jailer, it is your invitation. An invitation to step off the treadmill of repetition and into the field of redemption. So next time you catch yourself slipping into that old pattern, pause, place your hand gently on your heart, and remember, you are the bridge between what was and what can be. Let your parenting be a prayer, not a performance. And when you repair, don't wait for perfection. Do it trembling, do it late, do it anyway. Because every act of repair is a declaration. This stops with me. There comes a moment, after all the lessons, after the sleepless nights and the whispered prayers, after the tears of frustration and the quiet smiles of joy, when you pause, not because everything is perfect, but because something inside has shifted. You are no longer just raising a child. You are walking a sacred path of becoming the parent your soul always longed for, becoming the ancestor your descendants will thank silently in their moments of strength, becoming the healing balm in a lineage marked by scars. Throughout this journey, you've likely realized that karma isn't punishment, it's remembrance, a sacred invitation to awaken, to rise, to choose differently. And Parenting is karma's most profound stage, where the soul rehearses its most intimate truths in front of the mirror of a child's eyes. But remember this, no parent is ever fully healed. No family is ever without flaw. And yet within the imperfection lies something more beautiful than perfection itself, the willingness to try, to show up even after falling, to listen even when your own voice trembles, to break cycles even when your own foundation shakes beneath you, to repair even when you were never taught how. This is not weakness, this is sacred strength, and this strength becomes your child's inheritance, not just your genetics, not your stories, but your courage, your grace, your conscious love. So if you're still wondering whether you're doing enough, pause, breathe, feel. Your very question is a sign that you are. Because only awakened hearts ask such questions. Maybe your child will never say, "Thank you for healing the karma." But one day they will sit under the stars or stand beside a child of their own, and something inside them will feel lighter, freer, safer, and they won't know why. But you will, because you did the work, because you walked the path, because you became. So here, at the closing of this sacred journey, we bow not just to the children, but to the parents, to the mothers who love fiercely, to the fathers who soften, to the grandparents who whisper old truths, and to you, yes you, the one listening now, holding both wounds and wisdom in your chest, choosing to do it differently. You are the revolution. You are the karma breaker. You are the sacred parent your lineage has been praying for. May you keep walking. May you keep healing. And may love, real love, not the perfect kind, but the conscious, messy, divine kind, always guide your way home. The journey continues, and so do you.